All right, this is lecture number 8. We were dealing last time with the Articles of Confederation and the Constitutional Convention. And we said when those 55 delegates came together in the summer of 1787 in Philadelphia, there was one general issue and two specific issues that they had to deal with. The general issue, you might remember, was how strong to make this new national government. The two specific issues were representation and slavery, and I want to begin with representation here. The disagreement on representation came between the large and the small states. Large and growing states wanted increased power in a new national government. Small states feared that they would have little power in this new government. Debate on representation really centered on two plans. Now we're going to talk about a third plan, not because it gets serious consideration, but rather because it's offered by someone of great importance, Alexander Hamilton. But the real focus is on two plans, the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan. The Virginia plan for representation was written by James Madison, but it was presented by the 34-year-old governor of Virginia, Edmund Randolph. Now, why wouldn't Madison just present his own plan? Well, James Madison understood his drawbacks. Arguably the best intellect in the founding period, James Madison was not an impressive figure, however. Madison had been sick as a young man. He was barely 5 feet tall, just over 100 pounds. He had a very weak, sort of wispy voice. He could put together a good plan, but he couldn't sell it, at least in his own mind. So he asked the 34-year-old, tall, dark, handsome, swarthy governor of Virginia, Edmund Randolph, to present the plan, and he did. Randolph suggested that representation would be determined by population. Now, in the case of Virginia, this makes perfect sense. Virginia far and away has the largest population of any of the states. When Edmund Randolph makes this suggestion that representation should be based upon population, the delegates from the small states rose to their feet, jumped to their feet, and began to shout at Randolph, right? You're a usurper, you're a despot, you're a tyrant, all those things that we heard about George III. You're trying to make us second-class citizens. There was such mayhem in the Constitutional Convention at that moment that the president of the convention, George Washington, gavelled things to a close, and he sent people home. It wasn't until they came back that a second plan is offered, and that second plan is known as the New Jersey plan. It's the small state plan. Virginia plan is known as the large state plan. The New Jersey plan is the small state plan. New Jersey plan is offered by William Patterson of New Jersey, and he said that representation should be equal among the states. He reasoned that the states were represented equally under the Articles of Confederation, and as a result, why should we change that? Well, we're at an impasse, right? We have the large states want representation based upon population. The small states want representation to be equal. We're going to settle that disagreement in just a moment, but I do want to mention the third plan that's offered, again, because it's offered by Alexander Hamilton. While it didn't receive serious consideration, this third plan sought to create a system of government much like the British system. Hamilton, I don't know if this was a case of him not knowing his audience, if it was a case maybe of arrogance, or if this was genuine belief. But Hamilton stood up and said to this room of founders, gentlemen, we don't have to recreate the wheel. We have an example, the best example of government ever created in the British system. Let me give you some of the features that Hamilton wanted to see in the new American system. And these features are all designed to bring stability to the system. For instance, he wanted senators who would serve for life. Not a 6-year term, not a 4-year term, not a 2-year term, but senators who would serve for life. He reasoned that this would provide stability. He wanted an executive who would serve for life. Now, this is going to come back to haunt him. Anytime Hamilton's name is mentioned down the road as a possible candidate for the presidency, people are going to refer to the Convention of 1787, and they're going to say, well, remember, Hamilton liked the British system, and Hamilton wanted an executive for life, and in fact, he wanted a king. And this sort of charge of royalism is going to hurt Hamilton anytime he's mentioned as a presidential candidate. Again, Hamilton's reasoning is that that would bring stability to the system. He immediately said, look, I don't want a king. I'm not suggesting that this should be hereditary. When the executive dies, I don't believe that the job should go to his son or daughter. We're not creating dynasties. But he said the executive should serve for life, and that would provide that much needed stability. He also thought that the national government should have the power to override state law. Understand that this stands in stark opposition to what is created in the end, a system of federalism, where the federal government has some responsibilities, the state has some responsibilities, and in effect, they are both centers of sovereignty or power. So, as I said, Hamilton's plan is not really given serious consideration, but it is offered. Let's go back to the two plans that are taken seriously, the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan. The question is, how do we settle this? And a way forward is not immediately clear. Before a compromise was reached on these two plans, the delegates actually considered erasing the borders of the existing states and reapportioning each state so it would be equal in size and population. Things got pretty extreme. An exasperated Benjamin Franklin at one point offered to give part of Pennsylvania to Delaware, just to shut them up, in his words. Well, the solution comes from an unlikely source. What is known as the Connecticut Compromise or the Great Compromise is offered by a delegate named Roger Sherman. Roger Sherman says to the group, look, we don't have to choose between these two plans. We can have the best of both worlds. We can have an upper house where the states are represented equally. In the Senate, each state will have equal representation. Today we have 2 senators per state. We will have a lower house where representation will be based upon population. What Roger Sherman was suggesting is what's known as a bicameral legislature, a 2-house legislature. Under the Articles of Confederation, that didn't exist. There was a unicameral, a 1-house legislature. Now, even though Roger Sherman offers the eventual solution to this problem, when he finishes speaking, nobody's terribly impressed. There's no eureka moment. It takes a period of days of James Madison working behind the scenes to bring delegates around to Sherman's position. In the end, it is adopted. We have a bicameral legislature today, and Roger Sherman really saves the convention with that suggestion. The second specific issue that the delegates had to deal with was slavery. The difficulty with slavery was in fashioning a document that would garner support of enough Southern delegates. Remember, 12 of the 55 are slave-owning or slave plantation delegates. The delegates chose to deal with the issue of slavery in 2 ways. First, knowing that Southern delegates would not support an immediate abolition of slavery, they chose to put off significant action for a period of 20 years. Written into the Constitution, here I'm talking about Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1. Written into the Constitution itself was a protection of the slave trade until January 1st, 1808. Abolitionist Northerners, while they would have preferred to outlaw slavery immediately, were willing to accept this temporary protection because both public opinion and national trends suggested that the institution of slavery wouldn't live much longer. Right? The number of slaves coming into the country every year was going down precipitously. Northern abolitionists believed it was just a matter of time until slavery died a natural death. In other words, those who opposed slavery expected that if it did not die of its own accord by 1808, it would take a simple action of Congress at that point to put the final nail in the coffin of the hated institution. Additionally, it was reasoned, rather naively I think, that this 20-year protection would allow the southern states time to reorder their economies for a day when slavery no longer existed. And also naively, it would allow them time to prepare slaves for freedom. This approach, agreed upon in order to try to placate the fears of Southern delegates, is evidence of the so-called gradualist or incremental approach adopted by some of the founders to the abolition of slavery. In the end, January 1st, 1808 came and went without either the natural death or the abolition of slavery. The reason for this is the intervening invention by Eli Whitney of the cotton gin, which made slavery a much more profitable institution. Let me explain what the cotton gin is. Gin is just short for engine, so this is the cotton engine. Prior to the invention of the cotton gin, you would have slaves go into the field, they would pick cotton, you'd have a big pile of cotton, and then slaves would sit around that pile of cotton, and they would literally pick out the husks, right? This is where we get the term cotton pickers. They would pick out the husks so as to separate the good cotton from the not usable parts. Well, the cotton gin did this mechanically, and it did it very, very quickly. So those numbers of new slaves coming into the country that had been dropping over time, that trend reverses because more slaves are needed to go into the fields to keep up with the mechanical cotton gin, to feed the gin. So slavery that had been dying as an institution is reborn as a result of this invention. Nevertheless, on January 1st, 1808, Congress did agree to outlaw the importation of slaves to the United States. A step forward in the cause of abolition, right? It falls short of what a lot of folks wanted, full abolition. But those who say this is a good thing can argue that we're moving in the right direction. The second method by which the delegates sought to deal with the institution of slavery was through something called the 3/5 Compromise. The issue here was how slaves would be counted for the purpose of representation in the lower house, in the House of Representatives. There were two basic proposals put forward. First, non-slave states put forth a proposal to only count free persons for the purpose of determining representation. Slave states countered with a proposal to fully count slaves, as they represented a large population base in the South. The result was a compromise in which individual slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a free person. This compromise was offered by James Wilson of Pennsylvania, an abolitionist. Northern delegates saw this compromise as a victory for two reasons. First, it severely limited Southern power by limiting the number of Southern delegates in the House. Second, it moved the nation a step closer to full abolition. Now, cynical modern critics have suggested that this agreement provides evidence that it's the smoking gun of racist attitudes of a majority of the founders who somehow saw blacks as less than fully human. Well, this is a misrepresentation, and it's easily disproven. First, keep in mind it was the Southern slave owners who wanted to fully count slaves. It was the progressive Northern delegates that suggested not counting slaves at all. Second, in both the North and the South, free blacks were counted the same as free whites. If race were an issue, there would have been a movement to discount free blacks as well. Finally, it was a Northern abolitionist, James Wilson, who offered up the 3/5 Compromise. Now, I don't want to whitewash American history. There were absolutely delegates in that room who saw African Americans as less than fully human. But it's not what some have claimed. It's not the predominant view. It's not the majority view. And I think I've shown that that's the case. All right, some concluding thoughts on the Constitutional Convention. Because of these and other difficult issues, many times during the convention, the founders thought about giving up. At no time during the summer of 1787 do George Washington's letters or his diary convey much hope. George Mason, delegate from Virginia and signer of the Declaration of Independence, signaled his frustration when he wrote to his son. He wrote, quote, "I would not again serve in this convention for 1,000 pounds per day. The revolt from Great Britain and the formations of our new government at that time were nothing compared to the great business now before us." Additionally, delegates worried that they might be seen as going too far by creating an entirely new government. Remember, when they were selected, their charge had been to reform the Articles of Confederation, not create a whole new form of government. Fearful he would be accused of overreach, William Patterson of New Jersey said, "We shall be charged by our constituents with usurpation." Not lost on the delegates was the understanding that the Constitution they were creating would have great effect on future generations of Americans and around the world. James Wilson, that offered the Three-Fifths Compromise, said, "We're providing a Constitution for future generations and not merely for the circumstances of the moment." John Rutledge, South Carolina, said, "We're laying the foundation for a great empire." And James Madison said, "This plan will decide forever the fate of Republican government." They understood the importance of what they were doing. Finally, the convention in Philadelphia marked a shift in political leadership in the United States. Some major revolutionary leaders were unable to attend the convention. We've already spoken about Thomas Jefferson. He's not there because he is the American ambassador to France. John Adams, who'd been so important in drafting the Declaration, doesn't participate in creating the Constitution because he's our ambassador to Great Britain. Sam Adams chooses not to attend the Constitutional Convention because he thought it violated the spirit of '76. James Madison emerges as the most important of this new generation of leaders. Because of this essential role, he's known today as the father of the Constitution. Now, of the 55 delegates who attended throughout the summer, 16 of them refused to sign the final version of the Constitution. In fact, some of them actively campaigned against its ratification. Patrick Henry traveled around to a number of the ratification conventions and spoke against this Constitution. To his credit, when the Constitution was ratified, Patrick Henry said, "This is my Constitution, this is my country, I will support it." That's called loyal opposition. We've kind of lost that idea in today's politics. The form of government this group created has endured for over 230 years, with just over 24 amendments, 10 of which were adopted in the first year after its ratification. This is the Bill of Rights. Ours is the exception to the rule in terms of the enduring nature of our republic. One reason the U.S. has risen to the position of a world superpower in such a short time is the permanence of the system they created. The new Constitution established the American Republic as an example of liberty to the world. Thank you.